So welcome, community. I see you sitting in the half circle. This is the work by Saba Innab, a Jordanian Palestinian artist and architect. We have been today in a long program since 11:30 Saba. Musa started with the abolition garden, with the performance Dive in the Dark, and we have been engaging with the half circle that you have built for people in order to connect these works that has been displaced, that are in the diaspora, that have been looted often from their context, and how to engage with the people and the debate, and hopefully with restitution. So I'm very happy to introduce you to Saba Innab, as I said, Jordanian Palestinian artist and architect. She has been working not only with spatial strategies, but also with drawing, mapping, historical and urban research. She has been working in a long term in this project to conceive the displays in which we are engaging, and the half circle in which the collection is looking at us in order to give some subjectivity, some agency to the works back. She is this way reversing the gaze and problematizing one of the main violence of exhibitions, that is to transform everything in an object. In other terms, this machinery of objectification. As you enter, you see how Saba Innab had installed a barrier, so we don't see, somehow to visualize in a very difficult way how exhibitions are also power structures, that while we assume that they show, many times they're erasing culture, as in the case of colonial collections in which authors are erased, no? The date, the context of production, the colonial trade. I'm very happy to introduce your talk, Saba, that is at this moment in Amman, with a beautiful and powerful and operating concept, which is what is unseen cannot be broken. Please help me to welcome Saba.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Paz, for the introduction, and thank you for coming. I will share my screen now, and I hope you can see well despite the light in the space. Scene 1. Adnan Moulina, or Future Boy Conan, was premiered in the Arab region, Kuwait in particular to my knowledge, in the early 1980s. It is a post-apocalyptic sci-fi anime that supposedly takes place 20 years after World War III, which was supposed to happen in 2008. It is about the adventures of young adolescents in the middle of the ruins, trying to imagine the future from the edge of the world. An image of a very young girl, a toddler probably, crying, weeping with one arm up at her face and the other down holding something vague. The image was published in Al Arabi magazine, covering the Sabra and Shatila massacre in 1982, an apocalypse of our time. The massacre took place when the Israeli occupation army invaded Beirut in 1982. Sabra and Shatila Palestinian camps were sieged and 3,000 Palestinians were killed. I tried to find that photo, but I couldn't. Without really knowing or making the connection, Adnan Moulina and that image of the girl became one in my memory as a child, unconsciously building images of destruction in the present, wondering if there is any image of reconstruction in the collective imagination. In her book, Architecture and Modernity, a Critique, Hilda Heinen suggests, quote, modernity, Octavio Paz says, is an exclusively Western concept that has no equivalent in other civilizations. The reason for this lies in the view of time that is peculiar to the West, by which time is regarded as being linear, irreversible, and progressive, end of quote. A debatable proposition, of course, especially in how it centers the West, but what is striking here is the idea of time. In the Palestinian refugeehood and exile temporariness that gradually transforms or deforms into a permanent state, the notion of linear time, as Paz describes it, does not really exist. When you live in waiting and suspension, the present tense is never really now. I would like to call it the radical Palestinian time, as by declaring the constant temporariness, the resistance and return are always implicated. The canons of modernity and its architecture are products of ruin, canons that emerged from the trauma and the ruins of World War I. This is evident in the desire of the tabula rasa, whether by assuming it or inventing it. It unfolds constant violence that extends from the colonial into our current times. This violence was and still is a creative mechanism for capital generation, for instance, but also a vehicle that carries desire into the future by extracting, subtracting, shuffling spaces and their representation. One could argue that the destruction of Nahr al-Barid camp, a Palestinian refugee camp in the north of Lebanon, is a created tabula rasa, where the Lebanese government was projecting a desire into space, a model camp, probably. As I was standing in the middle of the bulldozed land of Nahr al-Barid 2 years after its destruction, the idea of reconstructing the destroyed camp held a revolutionary potential in the construction of spatiality itself, and with it, the possibility of rethinking building in temporariness. How do you rebuild the temporary? How do you build the space of waiting? In 2007, the Lebanese army demolished Nahr al-Barid, NBC as I would call it, after an armed conflict with Fatah al-Islam, a predominantly foreign Islamist fundamentalist group that had implanted itself in the camp just 6 months earlier. On account of the demolition, 33,000 refugees were displaced to al-Badawi camp, a nearby Palestinian camp, and the adjacent areas. The battles continued for a little over 3 months, and the destruction happened after the battles concluded. The destruction of NBC was justified with no actual justification, by the logic of exception of the extraterritoriality. It was the exclusion from the law that allowed the total and sudden destruction of the camp without any public or political justification, as it was promoted as a war on terrorism, which was further abused and to justify the militarization of the bulldozed camp. To be extraterritorial is to be exempt from the juridical system in a specific territory, such as embassies, army bases on foreign lands, UN agencies, to name a few examples. In these scenarios, this exemption assures the extraterritorial body protection from or superiority to the specific locality. When the same logic is applied to the camp and the refugee, it becomes a framework from which excessive discrimination and abstraction are justified. They become invisible. During the battles, the Lebanese officials had begun to make plans for reconstructing NBC and its future, with the keywords such as sovereignty, security, featuring prominently in the discussion, a vision of a model camp. At the same time, in Badawi camp, where most of Nahr al-Barid residents had taken refuge in public schools, a spontaneous grassroots initiative emerged intending to formulate a counterplan energized by the widespread conviction that Nahr al-Barid's destruction and the government's reconstruction plans were politically motivated. Named Nahr al-Barid Reconstruction Commission for Civil Action and Studies, NBRC, the group attracted activists and practitioners from outside and inside Nahr al-Barid. Without any documentation of its built environment, the camp was historically constructed incrementally by its residents. The only way to restore the spatial history of the camp was to reconstruct it from the residents' memory. The whole camp was mobilized for this reason. These studies imposed the community as the main partner in the reconstruction process, as they were the only actor in possession of that knowledge. The NBRC and the community principles also stressed the preservation of the original camp's fabric, social fabric, neighborhoods, circulation routes, and landmarks. The main architectural demand was the preservation of the extended family type dwelling as the camp's basic building block. Mental maps of spatial organizations, urban fabric, individual households, and typology analysis were created and validated in several community meetings, a datification that transformed the abstract body of the refugee and its invisibility into a grand gesture that commands space. Many moments in this extended refugeehood metamorphosis from being moments of liberation to moments of failure and vice versa, in a constant cycle of elimination and resurrection. The moment, for example, of the promise of liberation that was introduced in the armed struggle in the 1960s was transformed into a moment of failure and abused over the years to justify excessive discrimination and isolation by the same rationale that justified the destruction of the camp. However, a notion of liberation or power was resurrected from the same moment of failure, the absence of documentation, the invisibility that is rationalized by the extraterritoriality that allowed the possibility of the reclamation of the right to the space, to the return to the camp, as a prerequisite to return to Palestine, a poetic gesture, but also an extremely active political one. The original structure of the camp followed the villages of the refugees' origin that were depopulated and ethnically cleansed in Nakba in 1948. This original structure can be traced in different patterns of refugeehood and exile across many Palestinian camps and settlements of exile, whether in a city such as Amman in Jordan or a suburb such as Farwaniyah in Kuwait. Groups of relatives and social ties are the way to unravel the unknown. Gradually, the social structure is inscribed into neighborhoods and building blocks. In NBT, those Palestinian villages had been depopulated or destroyed lingered in the daily life of the camp as fiction and as desire, existing beyond their everyday use as names of neighborhoods. After the destruction of the camp, the depopulated landscape of the place of origin was projected, even reclaimed, as an imagined image on the bulldozed land. In Architecture and War, which he wrote during the siege, Libius Woods overlaid different frameworks and directions for the future reconstruction of Sarajevo. Although the text was mostly theoretical and abstract, it's probably one of the few attempts to tackle post-war from within a discourse of architecture formally, and departing from the present. In one of the sections, Wood suggests that old, between brackets, old cities are hierarchies that absorb the hierarchies that governs them, and that war, quote, war levels the old cities in much more than a physical sense. It reduces their multi-layered complexities of meaning to one-layered tableau embodying the monological structure of hierarchy at its most logical and terrible extreme. End of quote. And therefore, doomed to be new, whether they are used as a model for the reconstruction or built from scratch. From the same point of departure, reconstruction of the same fabric does not necessarily liberate the camp from the cycle of violence and does not provide necessary critique that could have been revolutionary. A failure of not being able to shift the collective subversive moment of mapping into another one with a spatial manifestation. How to shift the spatial reconstruction from the position of need to the position of desire. One can read the demand of the residents of Nahr al-Bared to preserve the previous fabric of the camp as part of the rejection of the repeated trauma and loss, as the magnitude of loss resonated with the Nakba on the micro level. The rejection is clear in how each one of the refugees held on to the right to return to their own created past in the camp, as if it was part of the whole return, the return to Palestine, poetically, but also to an individual territory in a context perceived as one monolithic entity, abstract and invisible. In 1982, the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze interviewed the Palestinian author Ilyas Sambar, founder of the Journal of Palestine Studies. The interview was very little known to the public until it resurfaced during the last war in Gaza in May 2021. Quote from Deleuze. Many articles in the Journal of Palestine Studies recall and analyze in a new way the procedures by which the Palestinians have been driven out of their territories. There are two very different movements within capitalism. Now it is a matter of taking a people on their own territory and making them work, exploiting them, in order to accumulate a surplus. That is what is ordinarily called a colony. Now, on the contrary, it is a matter of emptying a territory of its people in order to make a leap forward, even if it means making them into a workforce elsewhere. The history of Zionism in Israel, like that of America, happened that second way: how to make an empty space, how to throw out a people. End of quote. It is a lucid distinction, but I must stress that while the second method is the aspiration and the core of the settler colonialist system, the two exist simultaneously and feed each other in the now. The importance of this distinction is that it puts the land at the center of the liberation struggle. It is the soil and what is underneath it and what is above it. The situation of the evacuee, of the displaced, and the status of displacement takes different forms and positions, and so the resistance to it. It becomes the movement. In return, marches to borders, marches to depopulated villages, or even escaping a political prison, escaping a resisting siege, the land becomes the witness and the medium. What is unseen cannot be broken was the title of a work I showed at the Carnegie International in Pittsburgh, 2018. The work is based on a found image of a Gazan tunnel being partially exposed. A tunnel is an underground passageway dug through the surrounding soil, earth, rock, and enclosed except for entrance and exit. Seeing the tunnel strips it of its function, of its essence, of its being unseen. And in this context, invisibility is what keeps the tunnel existing. So seeing becomes destroying. When exposed, it becomes a sign of the colonizer and the sign of the impossibility of movement embedded within the structure. The exposed parts of the tunnel are modeled as fragments of a body that has been excavated as opposed to being exposed. And there's a big difference. Where everything changes its meaning immediately. An arch is a structural element when it's in the underground. Once it is seen in isolation, it becomes a reference to architectural gestures, a reference to authority. The fragments themselves become an oxymoron. This cast of an image was placed in the Hall of Architecture at the Carnegie Museum of Art with its collection of over 140 plaster casts of architectural masterpieces done on the original facades and objects which opened in 1907. A space of signs of hegemony and authority representing dominant architectural styles in pre-modern architecture from Gothic to Romanesque masterpieces. This body not only interrupts the space, but it's an invitation to imagine the source of this form, of the excavated body. It also has a temporal significance. Not only it freezes the exposed parts of the tunnel before its destruction, but it's a happening body of a continuous struggle. The analysis of the architectural and formal reference here is part of a bigger attempt to analyze the fragility of the refuge, exile, and siege, the fragility of the extraterritorial space, by isolating the architectural elements in order to see things are better recognized by their contraries. Quote, the presentation board submitted to the 1959 National Museum competition by architects Al Mansfield and Doragad left no room for misinterpretation regarding their cynic inspiration. At the top of the first board appeared an analogical sketch depicting an Arab village, specified in writing as the village of Malha near Jerusalem. Below it was a perspective of the proposed museum, portrayed an irresistible stereoscopic image of a hilly cubic cluster endowed with the borrowed authenticity and spontaneity of the vernacular architecture. We learn from the competition proceedings that it was this sketch, this enchanting analogy, that caught the jury's attention and was the prime reason for their choice of this project. The village of Malha was thus consecrated as the mythical origin of the National Museum of Israel. The hollowed image of Malha, which reappeared again and again, cannot be left in peace as a picturesque allusion and should rather be contemplated as a haunting, lingering trace of the massive ruination, confiscation, and cultural appropriation that followed 1948, the foundation of Israel and the Palestinian Nakba. End of quote. extracts from the object of Zionism by Zvi Efrat. The actual village of Malha was not demolished after 1948, only emptied of its inhabitants. Its stone houses were confiscated, suspended under the legal definition of deserted property, as the case for more than 400 Palestinian villages that were destroyed or depopulated during Nakba. The houses of Malha were occupied temporarily by Jewish immigrants until 1960s, before they were relocated to prefabricated housing. Malha later was occupied by squatters, bohemians, artists who reinvented the village as an artist colony. This transformation, if seen in any context, it would have been a case of a very familiar gentrification. Here, it has other layers of appropriation and disposition. The Palestinian peasant house became an object of fetish, a model for art colonies, a backdrop of a national museum, as well as an appropriation of know-how. According to the Fontana Dictionary of Modern Thought, vernacular in architecture is, quote, an adjective referring to an indigenous building style, generally the work of builders with no professional information, which is nonetheless considered to have special attributes and to be linked to a certain degree to a glorious past. Modern architecture has often set as one of its goals the establishment of a new vernacular, end of quote. In Shadan Awad's dissertation, a professor at Birzeit University in Palestine, on the contemporary meanings and syntax of the peasant house, Awad chooses the term traditional over vernacular. Quote, traditional architecture is everyday architecture that is alive because it's inhabited, essentially civilian, domestic, and pre-industrial construction. It is a form of architecture built using local resources, which covers materials, techniques, and the skills of its constructors. And it is the fundamental expression of the culture of the different communities and their relation with the nature and the landscape. The term traditional in connection with the Palestinian architecture is used to indicate those structures built in pre-modern Palestine, or other words, before the use of iron and cement for construction, according to Hirschfeld, end of quote. Peasants nearly everywhere preferred elevated sites for their villages. The village architecture took the form of a heterogeneous variety of built typologies, which were accompanied by a large variety of supporting elements and that are vital to domestication of the territory, such as dry walls, ovens, stables, etc., and the infrastructure elements such as canals, paths, irrigation channels, and so on and so forth. The traditional Palestinian buildings in the mountainous regions, both in towns and villages, used to be vaulted. The roofs were more or less flat with a low dome-like elevation in the center. If you look at the dome, or the typology of the peasant house, as an element that was and is dispossessed, depopulated, fetishized, appropriated in modern buildings of the state and in the image, from one side, and the tunnel, a know-how of movement against siege, of resistance, in the land and to the land. The former is the hollowed image, but the side that receives the movement, the rallies, the return, it is a static site but in movement. The tunnel is the movement itself. The two resemble a hybrid epistemic structure if we imagine the second as the movement of the first. Look at the two to realize how indigenous knowledge and resistance is faster than the daily colonization and appropriation. We realize that despite settler colonial extractivism and how it extends to appropriating know-hows, vernacular ways, and claiming them as new vernacular, indigenous knowledge itself that was appropriated keeps renewing itself as a tool for daily decolonizing, confronting, and returning. To conclude, and to link to the site that we are speaking from, I mean you're receiving in, we must think of return as we think of restitution and repair in the same complexity. We must interrogate the idea of transition and restitution. One must dismantle decolonization from the present as much as we do from the past or from the absence of the subjects and objects. Not only by recognizing how past colonial capitalist structures metamorphosed into new forms in the post-colonial context, but also by connecting to the ongoing settler colonialism, extractivism, and ethnic cleansing as a front for dismantling this violence, and recognizing how these know-hows are living beings that keep resisting and renewing themselves against all structures that generate their absence. And thank you very much.
Now?
Yes.
So now I'm speaking, and I think maybe you are unmuted. We will see how it works. So thank you, Saba. It's very interesting how Saba is working with special strategies. But one focus that I would like to highlight is that colonialism is not a history of the past. So in the project, many artists, and especially Saba, is working on the continuities, how colonialism is present. So how to talk not in the past, but in the ongoing structures, and especially in this case of exhibitions. Also, I want to share that in the workshops, we debated on Ariela Sulai, a Palestinian author, a scholar, and filmmaker, and how she addressed the problem that these collections had been separated from the people. So here, are you listening, Saba?
I am.
No. Okay.
I am.
Yeah, good. So here we'd like to Saba to share with us how the display where we are sitting and where the works from different that are diasporic, how you thought you conceptualize this reconnection and this engagement with people and the works to go against this violence of objectification and of separation, especially after your introduction in the struggle of Palestine, a community that struggled to have their land, the nation, in somehow connection with a collection that have lost their place too. The works from Papua New Guinea, from Cameroon, from Mexico, that has been displayed from their function, ceremonial or healing or everyday life, and had arrived in the studio of an artist in Germany, precisely in Berlin, and more precisely in Dahlem.
Yeah, it's not an easy question, I must say, but it was a very complicated process because you have to operate on different levels and think and always, think of this alternation between subject-object relation. For this particular project, I think, and I think I mentioned this before, it had involved a lot of counterintuition to be able to maybe step out of my questions a little bit to see the particular problem we are dealing with. Of course, we can draw a lot of connections between the two positions, and I think in general my general frustration of the decolonial discourse that I mean, theoretically and in practice, that it never functions in full when it comes to Palestine. We never use the same, not we, practitioners, academics even, they resist to use the language that needs to be used in the context of Palestine, that we keep actually correcting people constantly that it is not a conflict, it's occupation, it's not, simple things like that. When it comes to restitution, and if we think of repair in general, it is also abstract in a sense that we think of return of the object as something that is very simple, while the communities that these objects are returning to are still in the status of, even if they're liberated technically, they're still in the effect of the neo-colonial impact. You know, I mean, how do you return an object to a context that was stripped from everything, that was extracted completely? So in that sense, I see the connection, and I see the how things are interweaved. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
You can take all them as one
Oh,
person.
okay. Hi. Thank you so
Hello.
much for that. And if I understand correctly, you designed this installation here in response to the space. Is that?
Yes.
And I'm curious because I don't know so much about the space necessarily. Maybe you can speak a little bit more about the space that we're in, and what was it like for you to research it, or what did you find as you were researching, and how is this work that we're sitting in here speaking to all of the other aspects that we've mentioned today?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Well, the space used to be the studio of Anno Brecker, who's a neoclassic sculptor that who was part of the Nazi Party and was endorsed also by the Nazi Party. So that building itself has a very heavy and problematic connotation and history. So how do you bring also this question in this space? That was also another challenge, and that was another layer that needed to be dismantled. So, for example, breaking the monumentality and the symmetry and the authority of the space was very important. How to block its volume. So, as in choosing certain spatial strategies, I was trying also to dismantle the space as much as I was trying to dismantle the question of how to show and how to exhibit such collection, and how I think the two had met in some way, that the first intuition or the first impulse I had in the beginning, in the thinking process, was how to show and hide at the same time. How can showing be not revealing or exposing, and how to give agency, how not to basically give this advantage of examining an object. How do you show but still don't give that? A sense, I think there was like a desire to protect as well. So it was very much like this.
It's a question in the chat, Saba. Can you read it?
Of course.
Easier if you read it.
How do you conceive of the relationship between place, region, country, city, local community, and materiality? I'm not sure if I understand the question completely. Can you elaborate more? I mean, there's one of the areas of interest that I have is how to find the epistemic structure within the material itself, but not the material as in isolation, but rather the material through the know-how and building know-how in particular. So, so for me, the material sometimes it is linked to as I said, to a certain knowledge, to a certain building treatment, but also there's another layer that has to do with the the references of the material, the territorial references, or let's say class references, and the treatment of spaces. So in one of the areas of interest or research that I've been working on is how to take spatial moments of this extended refuge and exile and analyze them into an epistemic structure, more or less. So I know materiality is a very wide and general concept. Just however you choose to interrupt it, it makes sense about the know-how and the building treatment. Okay, so I answered your question, I guess. Thank you.
And do you hear me, Sarah?
I do.
Yeah, I want to share with Saba and with the audience that in the press, some critics more conservative has said about the exhibition that we criticize cultural appropriation, yeah, of the modernist artist. And the conservative that find it not adequate critic, they say, because every culture influenced from another one. For example, the Romans received influence from the Greek. So why we criticize Schmidt-Rottluff or the expressionist artist for getting influence from African or Oceania or from American India works. So just to reflect, to share how the exhibition is ongoingly read, also from conservative point of view, and to ask Saba, because you position the vernacular, the traditional, the indigenous, also how it has been appropriated. So I'm interested to hear your comment.
No, it's I think it's a very funny comparison, because when we think of the appropriation of someone like Karl Schmidt-Rottluff to of the artifacts, we're talking about structures of powers. We're not talking about something flat here, and this is what we're criticizing. It's not. It's not the act of appropriation in itself, but the fact that how it got there, how it was abused, how it's part of a colonial structure. He's a white privileged male artist, part of the colonial system that benefited from it. So yeah.
Thank you, Saba.
Thank you.
Transformed in vibration. This was very good comment. I'm glad we had this conversation, and
Me
that
too.
we stay all the time solid and attentive on how the exhibition is engaging everyone. So we are also responding with your comment to conservative positions this way. And I'm happy to see you soon when you come to Berlin. Send a sign. If you come for the finissage, March 20, Musa will be doing the transition.
Sadly, I will miss it.
Thank you, Saba.
Thank you very much, Paz, and thank you for attending. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.